Democracy Now!, where she is a co-host and a producer. Lily and Jeff both have recent excellent books, and we would like to get them in your hands. You can check out all of their books with your New York Public Library card, which obviously everyone in this room has. No one would come into this room and not have a library card, right? Because that would be very embarrassing and shameful. So great. So you'll get it with your library card, or you can purchase them. Lily's book, Radical American Partisanship, which she is the co-author of, is available for sale, and I believe Jeff's book, The Undertow, is still available for sale outside as well. I encourage you to get as many of them as you can. They are all quite remarkable works of political thought and journalism. And if you're watching online, you can also buy them from our shop online. We will put them in the link in the chat there. And I believe that Lily will sign books afterward. Is that correct? I think I see a thumbs up there, so I'm going to say it's a thumbs up, yes. Live from NYPL has some other fantastic events coming up in the days and weeks ahead. Tomorrow night in this room as well, Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah, who is the author of the new novel Chain Gang All-Stars, will be here. That is a really fantastic book, and I encourage you to come and join us. In the weeks ahead, Amelia Posanza will be here about her new book, Lesbian Love Story. Legendary street photographer Joel Meyerowitz will be here. Christian McBride, the jazz bass player, and novelist Luis Alberto Urrea. All of those are free. All of them are on our website at nypl.org/live, so please go register, sign up for our newsletter, and that way you'll never miss any of our other events coming up. Let's see. Lily's position at Johns Hopkins is with our friends at the SNF Agora Institute, and we are extremely lucky to be presenting tonight's conversation in partnership with them. If you're not familiar, the Institute is an academic center and public forum at Johns Hopkins University that is dedicated to improving and expanding civic engagement and informed, inclusive dialogue as the cornerstone of global democracy. So thank you to our friends at SNF Agora. We're really proud. We've been doing this for 2 years with them, and it's a really fantastic partnership. At the end of the conversation, Lily will be glad to answer some of your questions. You have note cards here, so you can write them down, and we will collect them. If you're watching online, put your question in the chat, and we will get those as well. Let's see. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos and Manaz Isbahani Bartos and Adam Bartos, and of course by all of you, our supporters here and everywhere else. Thank you for your support. Thank you for being here. And now join me in welcoming tonight's guests.
Good evening, all. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Aidan, for that lovely introduction. I have to say, for me, it's a particular honor to be here at the New York Public Library. It's a place I moved to New York over 20 years ago, and it was the first public institution I went to, and I've been going ever since. So thank you, Aidan, for thinking of me, you and your colleagues. And now, Lily, your books. I mean, it is the ideal time, in fact, just a little before this mad election cycle here begins, which seems to go on really interminably, that we look at the question of radical American partisanship. The full title of your book, Radical American Partisanship, Mapping Violent Hostility, Its Causes, and the Consequences for Democracy. So if you could just begin by explaining, which you do early on in the book, explain how you define radical American partisanship.
Yeah, that subtitle, I can never actually remember it. It's so long, so we maybe made a mistake. Right, so this project I co-authored with Nathan Kalmoe, and it basically originated out of, at the time I had written my first book on civil agreement, which looked at sort of how Democrats and Republicans feel about each other and why they might hate each other so much. And he actually was writing a book on partisanship during the American Civil War. And together we started thinking, you know, the most extreme measure of partisan animosity in the US that we're using, and this was in 2016, the most extreme measure is, how would you feel if your child married somebody from the other party? And thinking about Nathan's work, we were like, I wonder if maybe things are worse than we think because we don't ask people more extreme questions. And so we went into the literature. We started looking at the literature from just intergroup conflict and civil wars in other places. And what we found was that there's two main principles that make up what we're calling radical American partisanship. The first one is, we call it moral disengagement, which basically just means vilifying and dehumanizing people in the group that's not your group. So that's saying things like, people in the other party are not just wrong about politics, they're downright evil, or people in the other party don't deserve to be treated like humans because they behave like animals. We really did not expect anybody to be answering these questions in the affirmative at all. But no one had asked them before, so we thought we would try. The second aspect of radical American partisanship is just explicit approval of violence for achieving political goals. So to what extent do you think it's okay to use violence to achieve political goals? Again, no one had really asked these questions in American politics before, partly because we have this sort of exceptional idea of American democracy as is extremely and uniquely robust. Ultimately, we started measuring in 2017. We kept measuring all the way. We just got our 2020 election 22 data back, and we found that in the moral disengagement items, the vilification was up to 80% of Americans, depending on the question. The dehumanization question, we were getting around 30% of people saying that it's okay to treat people in the other party like animals. And then the violence questions, it started off in around 7% of people, and by the end was around 20% of people explicitly saying violence would be acceptable.
And so could you explain, like, what did you, because you look both at historical factors, but also psychological ones to try to understand this phenomenon. So if you could explain, first of all, what are the psychological phenomena that you look at, and how it is that you went about researching that? Like, what are the kinds of, how did you speak to people? How did you determine psychological proclivities and so on?
So we were looking into some of the previous research on why people would behave violently, or at the very least approve of violence, or why they would dehumanize people in the other party. And so we used some of the old theories that people have always used when they're studying groups that clash. And one is just an extreme loyalty to the group. And so we asked people questions like, when you talk about, Democrats or Republicans, whichever their party was, when you talk about Democrats, do you usually say we rather than they? To what extent do you feel like you are a Democrat? Those types of questions. So really getting into the social connection to the group. The other thing that tends to inspire violence across all of humanity is just aggressive personality. And so we didn't want to not be measuring something that's clearly going to be related to these attitudes. And so we asked people, do you get angry easily? Have you ever hit somebody before? Just regular, not political, just regular aggressiveness. And those two things were the most consistent predictors of approval of violence in particular, across all of our studies in the book.
Well, that's interesting. The use of we and they, like if they use the term we to refer to themselves and the party, that somehow suggested greater both attachment and potential for aggression?
Yes. So it's not just greater attachment. It basically is a way of saying the people in my party are my group of people, and I need to defend them against any threats that come against them. And the stronger that social, psychological connection to that group, this is true of any group. This could be racial groups, it could be religious groups, it could be any type of identity. The more you feel like you are a really, truly a good and loyal member of that group, the more you're willing to fight for the group, and the more that you perceive threats as almost, a threat to the group is like a threat to your individual person.
Wow, I hadn't actually thought of that, and this is a kind of aside, although maybe not really an aside, that it was, I was very struck when I first moved to the US that when you watch mainstream media here, the anchors, the hosts, often say we when they're referring to the US, like we should not be there, or we did this in Iraq, or etc. So I mean, I don't know what that says on the basis of what you said, but I guess we can draw our own conclusions. So one of the things that you point out in the book is that although most people, in terms of a kind of spectacular violent episode, what they think of is, of course, the Capitol insurrection of January 6th, 2021. But as you say, that's by far not the first incident of partisan violence in just the 2020 election cycle. So if you could just say, where this violence began, what the key incidents are, and in each context, what the proximate cause, like what caused it, what were the constellation of events, things that led up to it.
Yeah. I mean, we sort of have to go back in time to 2020. We were in our first year of a global pandemic. Things were really frightening and unstable and uncertain. We were beginning to have these arguments about whether we should be wearing masks in public places, whether we should be social distancing and closing down businesses. And Trump himself really did get involved in this and politicized the pandemic in a way that wasn't necessary. But he was tweeting out things like "Liberate Michigan," right, and meaning that the people of Michigan shouldn't be forced to wear masks or close their businesses. And then we saw in a number of state legislatures armed protesters arriving and at times occupying the state capitals of certain states, and then of course. Most famously, the plan to actually kidnap and potentially murder the governor of Michigan. Or is it? Yeah, Michigan. And then there was also a couple of just like weird things happening. Like there was a group of people who kind of tried to knock Joe Biden's campaign bus off the road. Oh, right. People were just very, very, very unsettled. And at the time, the president was not doing very much to calm people down. And in fact, he was sort of egging them on. So a lot of this was encouraging people who are already loyal to become much more active. They were also not only already loyal, but they were already very upset and very uncertain. And everyone felt threatened to some degree in the whole country. Mm-hmm. There was an element of taking advantage of that moment of weakness that we all were going through, and encouraging that to explode into more violence.
I mean, one of the things that you examine in the book is also the extent to which people on both sides of the political spectrum, Democrats and Republicans, to the extent to which people are kind of vulnerable to or persuaded by messages from political leaders, whether most pertinent to the period that you cover, Trump and Biden. So if you could, what is your understanding of why people, in fact, are so suggestible? What are there, because you looked at psychological factors, are there people who are more likely to be persuaded because Trump says do X, they're more likely to do X? Or not to, as in the case of Biden, and we'll talk about other instances later. But if you could say a little about that, why is it that people, or some people, are more likely to be persuaded by what political leaders say?
Yeah, so this is about an experiment that we did within one of our surveys, where we had some people read a quote from either Joe Biden or Donald Trump that basically said, violence is never acceptable, nobody should ever use it in politics. And then other people in the sample didn't read anything. And what we found was that the people who read these anti-violence messages, pretty short, just like a sentence or two, from either Biden or Trump actually, became less approving of violence than the people who read nothing. So that demonstrates that there is an effect, that leaders can calm people down, especially their own supporters. But actually what we found was that it didn't matter whether they read it from Trump or Biden. That any leader saying violence is not acceptable caused most people to just calm down and step back a little bit. And that really, it was a very, very simple thing to, it was 2 sentences long. It was a very simple message. The fact that we were able to move these attitudes at all with such a simple message suggests that people really they want to hear from their leaders. They want their leaders to stand up for things that they think are, valued and good and moral. Mm-hmm. And when they hear that, they are ready to follow.
Mm-hmm. And you also say, which I found actually quite staggering, that federal and state lawmakers in both parties, Republicans and Democrats, receive, in fact, thousands of threats a day, right? So first of all, is that a new phenomenon? And although the focus of your book is understandably the threats to Democratic lawmakers, what do we know about the threats to Republicans, from whom they come, and whether are they kind of equal in number or in, let's say, seriousness of the threat?
So it depends on where, obviously, the type of state, whether it's a swing state, that type of thing. What some other researchers have found is that the number of threats, especially to election workers, but also to local government officials, have been increasing substantially throughout the entire Trump administration. It skyrocketed during the 2020 election. And in general, what we actually saw was that there were a number of Republicans who were getting death threats, hundreds of them. I spoke to one individual person who said he received hundreds of threats, and he survived 3 attempts on his life. He was an election administrator in a swing state. And what they were saying was that those threats were coming from fellow Republicans, though. They were coming from people who didn't like the way that they certified the election. And so most of the threats, the implied violence, were coming from people who were very unhappy with the outcome of the 2020 election and wanted to intimidate the people who certified it.
And were you surprised by this finding, given the research? I mean, it's not just, I mean, you mentioned earlier as well, because the precursor, in a way, to this book is this book, Uncivil Agreement. So you've been looking at this question of the so-called radicalization or more extreme manifestations of American politics. So I don't know, was this shocking to you, or were you taken aback?
I mean, I want it to be, it should be shocking. We shouldn't expect this to be normal. It makes sense to me. And especially when you think about what we were just talking about, the political rhetoric of leaders. Trump's rhetoric was very, very different from Biden's rhetoric, right? Trump's rhetoric was entirely about having something stolen. And Biden's rhetoric was about calming down and relaxing and not participating in any kind of violent protest. Having a leader that isn't, consistently telling you that something has been taken from you, and it's not just you. And one of the things I talk about in Uncivil Agreement, the first book, is that one of the reasons that we're in this place now is that the Democratic and Republican parties have become very socially and culturally different from each other. And so when someone goes into a voting booth, for example, they're not just thinking about which party they want to win. They're thinking about the racial, ethnic, religious, geographic, cultural identities that they have now associated with their party. So it's not just about, which party does the right tax policy. Instead, it's about, people like me in all of these different ways are being threatened by this particular election. And bringing that into the voting booth is not something that is helpful, certainly for democracy. Battles over ethnic, religious power tend to descend into violence in other countries, and so this, bringing these other identities in has really created a situation in which the actual thought process of people in the voting booth is no longer really rational or thoughtful or logical, and instead extremely defensive.
So if you could say, I mean, what would be the comparable divisions between the parties? So you're saying, I mean, now socially and culturally, the divisions are along social and cultural lines. Would you say that previously it was really just policy and, demographically, let's say, or in terms of class, education, et cetera, there was an overlap? You couldn't determine party, overall, in a general sense, obviously not in specific instances, you couldn't determine party affiliation on the basis of the things that now it's fairly easy to do.
Yeah. Right. So the last time that the parties were really divided on an extremely divisive issue like race, it's really the Civil War. I mean, I'm not saying that there is a Civil War coming. Jeff might have disagreed with me, but the 60s were a time full of social upheaval in America. And the reason that didn't feel like we feel today is because that social upheaval was not happening along political lines. So we didn't have the parties taking different positions until 1964. But even partisans within the two parties, we didn't have them taking extremely different positions on things like civil rights legislation. And there were plenty of both Democrats and Republicans who were opposed to civil rights legislation and who were for civil rights legislation. So the parties were not divided along that extremely divisive line. And today, what we're seeing is the divide between Democrats and Republicans is very much associated with what you think about social equality for traditionally marginalized groups, what you think whether we need to make more progress to have a truly equal democracy, whether we've gone far enough and we should stop or we should go backwards, make America great again. All of those conversations are extremely difficult for us to have as a country. And it's almost impossible to imagine us having them in a very calm, rational way, right? The other thing, though, is to think about that there is a difference between the two parties in the extent to which they have, the identities that are aligned with the party. So the way that I tend to think about this is if you pick two random Republicans from the American electorate, the chance that they're the same race and the same religion are pretty high. If you pick two random Democrats from the electorate, the chance of the same race and the same religion is pretty low. The Democratic Party is much more of a heterogeneous mix of different groups, all kind of trying to work together. And one of the things that makes the Republican Party actually very powerful is its unity, right? It's much more unified. It's much more culturally homogeneous, and so that there's a real power there that the Democratic Party doesn't have. But it also creates a lot more animosity towards Democrats because they are unlike Republicans in so many different ways that feels like a social and a status threat.
So could you explain what you think accounts for that shift? I mean, is it just purely, presumably not exclusively, but it is demographic, like the shift in the demo?
Yeah. So I think there's two things going on. One is to go back to the 1960s and look at that civil rights legislation that happened in 64 and 65. What that legislation did was alienate a huge number of white Southern Democrats. And so they had previously been extremely loyal Democrats. They had thought of Republicans as like the bad guys in the Civil War, the aggressors in the Civil War. And so those voters could not call themselves Republicans right away. And what we saw was gradually over a generation, white Southern Democrats moving away from voting for Democrats and moving closer to voting for Republicans or identifying as independent or some sort of way station in between. And then the next generation was really able to fully identify as Republican. And at the same time, we also saw the Christian right in the 1980s come along, and so that also created these really clear cues for people. If you are an evangelical Christian, then you probably belong in the Republican Party. And so as those cues became more easy to see, partisan news also helped. The internet helped. It became very clear that if you're a white evangelical rural person, you probably belong in the Republican Party, and you probably don't belong in the Democratic Party. And that's those simple cues, those increasingly simplified cues, really did change what the voters thought of as what their partisan identity should be.
And you also, just to get into more kind of the effects of this, you devote an entire chapter in the book to the behavioral consequences of these increasingly violent partisan attitudes. Could you explain what some of those behavioral consequences have been?
Yeah, so this is one of the hard things about doing survey research on attitudes about violence, is that we don't actually know the number of people who are going to commit violence. And in fact, the probability that any of these people commits violence is pretty low. I don't think that there are a lot of, for example, militia members who are taking our surveys online. So there's a couple of ways that we tried to tease these things apart to see to what extent are people actually willing to harm other people. And so there are a couple of quirky psychological tests that you can do where we have, we say imagine there's a person wearing, you're going to administer a spelling test to this person and they're wearing headphones. And if they get it wrong, you can give them a loud blast of noise in their ears. And these are the decibel levels of those blasts of noise. And this is how much it is uncomfortable and or painful. And what we found was that Democrats and Republicans were much more willing to administer a really painful noise blast to somebody if they were in the other party. We also did a similar one where we were assigning them to require people to eat hot sauce. And we said, this person doesn't like hot sauce. This person does not like spicy things. And so, again, we showed them all the different levels of hot sauce, and we did see that people were more willing to kind of physically punish a person when they were from the other party. But I think the most important thing in terms of behavioral outcomes is actually not violence itself, but how having 20%, say, of the American electorate not condemn violence in the political context, how that might change the social norms or the political norms in the places that they are. And the people around them who might be much more volatile and not willing to take an online survey, those people are going to get less pushback from those who are now saying, well, maybe it's okay sometimes to use political violence. So to the extent that these people are now, increasingly a larger portion of the population, that's changing the norms. We used to have very strong norms against political violence, and those norms are being weakened.
And when there were these strong, when would you say that these norms changed?
It's hard to say exactly. We didn't start collecting data until 2017. So we can't actually go back in time. There are some surveys that, like in the 60s and one in the 90s, that asked, is it okay to use violence to overthrow the government if it is oppressing you? Which is not exactly the same question that we were asking. But so we can't really compare backward in time. We did see that they became more common throughout the Trump administration. So there were more and more people willing to advocate for violence from 2017 to 2021. Yeah.
So then the question is, there are several questions, but one is, how do you think the political context, the one that you just named, has impacted or even determined radical partisan views? Which comes first? Has an extreme political climate led to radical partisan views, or did radical partisan views lead to an extreme political climate?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. We don't know. What I would say is, going back to the leader rhetoric idea, the idea of the power of a leader's rhetoric, we really did see a change. The Trump administration and the Trump campaign, 2016 campaign, was a big shift in the ways that people believed that they were allowed to talk in public about very divisive things. And in addition, during the 2016 campaign, there were a number of rallies where Trump was just openly saying, why don't you go punch that guy? And advocating actual violence in the rally itself. So Trump's rhetoric was extraordinarily unique in the history of presidents. And the fact that he basically would say things that would have had another politician, giving up the campaign altogether. But he just didn't. And he kept going, and people were really, and his supporters were really into it. This whole anti-PC idea is, if you say something you're not supposed to say, that's even more attractive for some people. So I really do believe that the rhetoric was a huge part of it. I don't think that a Mitt Romney 2016 campaign or presidency would have had the same effect.
Well, I guess, the question is, why were and are indeed so many people so keen on him nevertheless, or maybe because?
So the realignment that I talked about, the social and cultural realignment between the parties, it really was not complete until Obama's second term. And one of the ways that became completed was actually just the fact that Obama was who he was, not because of anything that he said necessarily, but just because he was a black man in the White House. What that did was it communicated to people who had not paid any attention to politics before what a Democrat looks like. And so there were a number of people who had not been paying attention to politics who saw, the face of the president on the newspaper or whatever, in a place that you don't, everyone kind of knows what the president looks like, even if they're not paying attention. And that, along with a sort of explosion of right-wing media, encouraging people to say, he's not a real American, that's not who we are, that's not what we look like. That combination of factors really solidified for a lot of Republicans that they were really Republicans, that maybe they hadn't paid attention before, but now they're Republicans. And so that really, what Trump did was not make people pay more attention to racially divisive language. What he did was take people who really liked racially divisive language and bring them into the Republican Party, where they had previously not been voting or they had not been active. So he really activated a latent group of Americans who, if you pay more attention in your campaigning to healthcare, and education or something, then that group of people doesn't like what you're talking about and they're not going to participate in politics. That's not interesting for them. What Trump did was say, it's okay to make your political decisions based on these racial and gender-based attitudes. And if you want to do that, I'm the candidate for you. So he really, he centralized this sort of resentment based on group status and group identity that no one had really been able to do it in modern history.
I mean, could you connect that to, because another point that you make in the book is that politics, just for ordinary Americans, is far more aggressive than previously thought. I mean, what exactly do you mean by that, and how is that manifested?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is just that I mean, we haven't asked these questions, so again, I can't go back in time, but part of the reason that we never asked these questions of people is because we didn't think that there was any chance that people would say, yeah, I think people in the other party are animals. It just never occurred to scholars of American political behavior that this is how Americans would talk about their political opponents. It wasn't on the list of reality things that you could test or that you even should test. And the fact that when we started doing these surveys, there were a lot of people who thought it was ridiculous for us to even ask these questions because they didn't think that it was important or it wouldn't be a potent force in the American electorate, that regular people just don't think this way. And so part of the project was just demonstrating that these attitudes are more prevalent than we thought. And they got worse during the course of the Trump administration. By the way, though, there's good news is that actually they seem to be not going down, but they've stabilized during the Biden administration. So they went up, and now they're just flat, which is a good thing. We're not still on the upward trajectory. We don't know if that's going to last, and we don't know what that means for 24. But there's a little good news there.
Well, although I mean, not to be the bearer of bad news, but just after his town hall. Which, of course, followed him being found liable for sexually abusing and defaming the writer E. Jean Carroll. His ratings went up and became even more popular. And in fact, just this CNN reported that Trump's edge in surveys of Republican voters and endorsements from elected officials at this stage, that is, immediately following the town hall, is among the strongest for a non-incumbent in the modern presidential primary era. Trump is polling on average north of 50% in national polls of likely GOP primary voters. So, I don't know, make of that what one will. So let's go to this question of polarization, because obviously, a polarization, that is the divisions between the two parties, hasn't always taken the form, as you make clear in the book. But despite the form that it's taken, you've said, you conclude that partisan polarization is a democratic necessity, especially when one party is working towards advancing democracy while the other is violently opposed to it. So if you could explain, the form that you think this kind of partisanship can take that is less obviously conflictual and much less violent.
Yeah, I've been increasingly convinced that the word polarization is a very convenient word because it doesn't blame anybody and it doesn't identify any real problem. There's nothing to solve when we talk about polarization. And so in places where, either a room full of scholars of American politics or journalists, we have these very, very strong norms of political neutrality. And what that means is that a word like polarization is very attractive to us. It allows us to not take any particular position. And so one of the things that I think, and there's a couple of other scholars who've sort of been getting near this too, is to say that when we say polarization, we're not identifying any particular threat to democracy. And the idea that polarization could be good, right? If we have one authoritarian party that is undermining and trying to destroy democracy, you don't want the other party to become more authoritarian just to make polarization less, right? That's not what we want. And we also, I personally think, should be pretty adamantly pro-democracy in our stances. I mean, I think that both academics and journalists do have some responsibility to democracy itself. So to the extent that there is this sort of faction within the Republican Party that Trump has really activated or attracted into the party that had been kind of floating around in the electorate earlier, That's a faction of people who don't really like democracy. They're not interested in a multi-ethnic, pluralistic democracy in the way that our Constitution has set it up, that as a goal for this country, and so to take the word polarization in order to avoid taking any position doesn't identify where the threat to democracy is coming from. And so to the extent that we can, at the very least, just say we're pro-democracy, and we think that more people should have voting and rights and, the sort of the things that are like in the Constitution. That I think is, the polarization discourse is an impediment to that kind of conversation.
And well, to what extent do you think, that it's exacerbated the polarization, division because it's such a deeply entrenched two-party system. Yep. So, there's no third, fourth, fifth.
Right, and in multi-party systems, people tend to not hate their political opponents the way that Americans do.
Right.
And that's partly because in multi-party systems, in general, you have to make coalitions with other parties. So some people, basically, some parties are sometimes in your group, and sometimes they're not in your group. What that means is that when you win, they don't necessarily lose, and vice versa. With a two-party system, we have a situation in which if one party wins, the other party loses no matter what.
Exactly. Yeah.
And they're never going to be in a coalition with each other. It's impossible. And there's actually some interesting work right now coming out on the possibility of, if America had a multi-party system, there would be at least 4 parties right now already. There would be like the Bernie Democrats and the Hillary Democrats, and there'd be the Trump Republicans and the Romney Republicans. There would be at least 4. Yeah. But there are no coalitions that we can build because we're stuck into this very rigid two-party system. Mm-hmm. That wasn't actually intended. The founders didn't intend for us to divide on party like this. They thought that big states versus little states would be the problem. And so that's why we have the Electoral College. But this is the way that it immediately evolved. And so it really is a weakness of the system, and it allows for kind of unrestrained extremism among a party that cultivates a loyal following. There's very few... basically, it's harder to hold extremist candidates accountable when partisan loyalty is at its highest.
So I'd like to ask you about that, because one of the things that you cite at length, actually a beautiful passage from Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. So I'll just read the bit that you cite to ask what you see in the present conflict. In the present context, what kinds of conflict you see as potentially emancipatory in a similar way. So this is the citation from Letter from a Birmingham Jail, which you cite in your book. It's written 60 years ago, to address to white moderates who were concerned that the civil rights movement was moving too fast and pushing too hard. He wrote, quote, "The present tension in the South is a necessary phase of the transition from an obnoxious negative peace in which the Negro passively accepted his unjust plight to a substantive and positive peace in which all men will respect the dignity and worth of human personality." So that's Martin Luther King writing 60 years ago. First of all, why did you choose that passage, and how do you see it as pertinent in the present context and the conflicts that you unveil in this book?
Yeah. So one thing that we haven't talked about is there's a finding in the book where we show that the Republicans who are highest in vilifying and dehumanizing Democrats are those who are also really high in racial resentment against Black Americans and hostile sexism. The Republicans who are very low in racial resentment and sexism are some of the most tolerant people in our entire samples. So they don't dehumanize Democrats. They don't say that they're evil. They don't think they're a threat to the country. For Democrats, it's a weaker relationship. But basically, the Democrats who are the lowest in racial resentment are slightly more vilifying and dehumanizing of Republicans. And so what that shows us is that part of the fuel that is driving this divide between Democrats and Republicans is this really deep disagreement about equality, whether we've made enough progress, whether we need to make more progress. Do we want to go back? Do we want to go further? And the fact that those attitudes are so central in this divide, I mean, the way that, and I'm also finding this in new data where we're looking at Christian nationalism and ideas about patriarchy and replacement theory. These matters of equality really are part of the reason that our divide is so difficult. And so one of the ways that I try to be optimistic about this scenario is to say, if this country were ever to have a reckoning with its legacy of racial violence and prejudice and oppression, and gender-based violence and oppression, then there is no world in my imagination in which the people who advocate for the traditional social hierarchy would just sit down and be like, okay, fine, you can have it. Right? There's just no way that would ever happen. And so if we were to start having that conversation as a country, and there's been a lot of social change over the last few decades. Like my own mother couldn't get a credit card for herself without her husband's permission when she was 28 years old. So there's been a lot of very rapid change in terms of our ideas about equality and who is an American and who belongs. And so if we are in a process of really evolving into a more egalitarian, more pluralistic country, then I would imagine everything will look just exactly like it looks right now, right? You have a sort of far-right extremist playing on racial and gender insecurities, resentments, feelings of loss of status. That's an inevitable outcome of a rapidly equalizing society. So on my optimistic days, I think, if we're on a path to a more fulsome democracy in this country, then we shouldn't be surprised that we're seeing what we're seeing right now. And the only question is, do the wheels stay on the car? Do we get over the bumpy part of the road to a more pluralistic place, or does this backlash win?
So I'm going to go in a second to some of these very good questions we've received from the audience. But before I do that, just one last question, which is the conclusion of your book, where you look at, it's called The Future of Radical Partisanship, Risks and Opportunities, where you look at U.S. census projections. And you quote from an article by Yoni Applebaum in The Atlantic called How America Ends, in which, quote, he says, the United States is undergoing a transition perhaps no rich and stable democracy has ever experienced. Its historically dominant group is on its way to becoming a political minority. So could you elaborate on what the determining census projections are, and what you see as the implications in the very near future?
Yeah, the census projections are basically what they have projected is to say that by the year 2045-ish, the U.S. will be minority white. It will not be majority anything. And some political scientists have actually just told people that piece of information, and they become more conservative. White people in particular become a lot more conservative when they hear that piece of information. So it has a real effect on people, the idea of that. And in fact, kids today who are 10 and under are not majority. There is no ethnic majority. There's no racial majority in kids under 10 in the U.S. So that's how they get those projections, is they look at the babies, right? And then you can project the future. What that means, and there's this great book called How Democracies Die by some Harvard political scientists, where they look at other countries, and yeah, it does seem like there really hasn't been a country where the ethnic majority becomes a minority in a peaceful and orderly way. It is really difficult for a country to do that, and often the previous ethnic majority will engage in violence in order to preserve that status, not the status of majority, but the status of being in charge. And so, things like authoritarianism come out of the groups or the interests of a group that is shrinking but wants to retain political power. And as long as we have a functioning democracy, a shrinking group has less political power. That's just by definition the way that democracy works. If it's important to hold on to that power, then we're going to see much more anti-democratic behavior in the interest of preserving disproportionate power for a shrinking group.
So you think that's inevitable?
You mean the 2045?
No, the violence that will result as a consequence of this.
I don't think it's inevitable. I think that we've never done it.
Right.
But who knows? We're already seeing more violence, right? So we're sort of in it already. January 6th happened, and an attack on the United States Capitol we've never seen that from a domestic attack on the United States Capitol the way that we saw that occur. So yeah, it's already here, and there's a lot of violent rhetoric and there's a lot of violent beliefs out there. I think that the question is, does it get worse as this process goes on, or are electoral consequences in a functioning democracy enough to preserve some sort of orderly change?
Okay, so now let's go to the some of the questions from the audience. One is, what was the most surprising revelation from your research?
Honestly, I think it was partly that real power of those like cultural divides, the racial and gender attitudes, and the way that they seem to be affecting how Democrats and Republicans think about each other to such a strong degree. For me, it crystallized kind of how we got to this place, and we're not having arguments about tax policy. We're not having arguments about regular things in democracy, what government's role should be, what government legislation should do. That's not the conversation that we're having. We're having a conversation about who gets rights as an American. And so having that as a really stark outcome, for me at the very least, made it clear that and the more that we see people, politicians in particular, playing on those sort of grievances, cultural grievances, the more they're focusing attention away from the place where political attention should probably be focused, which is what government does.
Next, are progressive Democrats as responsible as people like Trump for bringing violence through their ideas of cancel culture, aggressive pressure, and shame about the U.S.'s past, doing that rather than creating discussion?
So, I mean, the stark numbers are no. In terms of domestic violence, the domestic terrorism, the far right terrorism is by far the most prevalent that we have in this country. And far left, this is according to FBI statistics, the far left violence is just not really increasing very much. Or even fundamentalist Islamic terrorism, right? The types of domestic terrorism that we're seeing are increasingly led by far-right extremists. So that violence that's coming from militias and that kind of thing, that's almost exclusively far-right violence. In terms of cancel culture and trying to shut down debate, I mean, this is all wrapped up together with Trump's, this sort of unifying call of anti-PC discourse. And because really what he did was to say, you're allowed to say what you want to say. I don't care whether somebody gets offended. I don't care if somebody feels excluded. I don't care if it's harmful to people. You should just be allowed to say it. And that, I think, is bumping up against the progressive idea of please don't harm people with your language. I'm asking you not to do that, which can come across as really offensive. Understandably, right? It's being corrected in public is extremely painful, and but it's not necessarily. I don't think that's creating violence on the right. I think that the rhetoric, pro-violent rhetoric from anti-PC leaders, is much more capable of creating violence. Someone who is canceled isn't necessarily just going to go harm Democrats harm Republicans. There's not a lot of evidence for that, but. I mean, things change.
To what extent do you feel that political violence and anti-democratic extremism in domestic U.S. politics is influenced by U.S. foreign policy, which to the outside world is framed by dehumanizing and aggression, that is, us versus them policies?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the exact answer to that question, but I think that there is no human society that does not dehumanize somebody. It's very rare for us to find a large society that is extremely equitable to all humans. So, and particularly, this is one of the things that my first book really goes into, is the social psychology of intergroup conflict. And one of the things that we know is extremely deeply rooted in the American brain and psyche the human brain and psyche, is that we are built to create an us, and in order for there to be an us, there has to be a them. And so that can play out if we have a very strong national identity as Americans, that's us. That dynamic can play out in an international context. So us is Americans, them is people in a different country, particularly with a very different culture or different shape of society. But if our leaders, encourage us to look inward, then we can say that the us is one party and the them is the other party. Mm-hmm. And so we can essentially directing our discriminating attention to a domestic group rather than a foreign group. It's not good when anyone does it. It is the source of most violence in the world. And the idea of thinking of another group of human beings as subhuman, it's still pretty unpopular, right? 20% of people willing to say that about the other party still means that 80% of Americans are not willing to say that at all. So I do think that both of those they're not necessarily connected in a causal link, but I do think that both of those dynamics are rooted in the same basic human instinct to find an us and in order to do that, to identify them.
Mm-hmm. And I guess this is a kind of related question, which is to what extent is polarization a global phenomenon?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the things that are happening in the US are not the same as things that are happening everywhere. Like we said, we talked about the two-party system, which really exacerbates these types of things. But there are the sort of social progress that we talked about that's happened over the last few decades is pretty, in Western democracies is pretty universal. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we saw, for example, in the UK is that with the Brexit debate, the parties didn't hate each other. Labour and Conservatives didn't hate each other, but people who were Leave versus Remain despised each other. And so a lot of that was really fueled by anti-immigrant sentiment, according to survey research in the UK. So it does seem like when we have these really rapidly shifting ideas about social equality, it's very easy to find a scapegoat in people who are not like us, whatever that means, right? So it's either people who are new to the country, people who don't share our religion, people who are, just look different from us. And so all of those are very ripe places to find human divides. And I think what we're seeing is a lot of people feeling extremely uncomfortable with the progress that we have made and looking for someone to blame for that discomfort.
And another question is whether increasing economic inequality is a contributing cause of an increase in political violence. Is that something you look at, actually?
I haven't looked at it, but other political scientists have. Yeah. Apparently, income inequality itself doesn't actually predict political violence in a country. It really is, honestly, in most countries, it does seem like what the literature has shown is that it's when the political divide follows ethnic or religious lines. That's when civil wars tend to erupt, or genocides. And the income inequality makes that worse, I think. I think it exacerbates the effect of having these ethnic and religious divides are they feel worse if you're feeling like someone else is getting something you're not getting. Mm-hmm. But there was a lot of really good data coming out of even after the 2016 election where people, basically people were saying, like, I don't even want healthcare if my tax dollars are going to pay for their healthcare, right? I don't want those people to have it. I'm willing to sacrifice my own health. And this is something we see over and over is a lack of attention to individual material well-being in order to get group-based ethnic or religious superiority or a sense of superiority or regaining of status for that group. People are willing to sacrifice a lot of material well-being in order to have their group seem like it's the best group.
So we just have time for a couple more questions. To what extent do you feel that the present electoral system, a crowded primary that involves courting votes on the fringes of the party, contribute to the present violence and extremism in politics? I guess this is also connected to the question of which there was another about the two-party system here and how that concentrates.
Yeah, so I think that there's very mixed evidence on whether our primary system actually increases extremism in terms of ideological extremism, meaning that if you think that taxes, if the primaries don't push people to like change their opinions on taxes, it remains to be seen whether that's actually true when it comes to anti-democratic ideas, anti-small d, like anti-democracy ideas, and there are people that are currently studying this. It's sort of it's a reemerged field of political science. The Electoral College, I think, is something that doesn't help. I don't think it's necessarily the reason that we have all of these disagreements, but it does create a situation in which there can be a feeling of deep, deep injustice if someone wins the popular vote and loses the Electoral College. And that's a very messy scenario for us. If we're already deeply divided along parties, if our parties are culturally and ethnically divided, having one party technically win the majority of votes and not get control of the seat, that's a recipe for disaster, I think.
Okay, and finally, last question. Can you explain how the local and national radio airwaves have come to be monopolized by conservative right-wing talk show hosts and the extent to which their dominance influences our current social, cultural, and political climate?
Right. So I'm not an expert in this, but I'm going to put it together with sort of the general idea of our media ecosystem now, which is increasingly nationalized. There is sort of the death of local news. A lot of our politics has become nationalized, so that even if you're voting for dog catcher, it matters to you whether it's a Democrat or Republican. And previously, local politics actually it prevented us from really hating each other on a national level, because your local guy could be, he's a Democrat, but he fixed all the roads, so let's bring him back. And so to the extent that we have our local newspapers, our local radio stations, to the extent that those are becoming nationalized, that really does change the discourse. It changes the way that we understand politics. And it undermines the one place where I think Americans really can make political progress, which is at the local level.
Okay, well, thanks so much. I'm afraid now we are out of time, but Lily has very kindly offered to sign books there, right?
I think so. Yeah.
So thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you, Lily.
Thank you.
On y va.